Imagine a world where entire civilizations vanish, once thriving cities lie in ruins, and even the art of writing is forgotten. Was it an apocalypse or the dawn of something new? For centuries, historians have told the story of the Bronze Age collapse as a tale of destruction. Powerful empires like the Mycenaeans, Hittites, and Egyptians falling one after another, trade grinding to a halt, and the world plunging into a so-called Dark Age. But what if that's only half the story? What if this wasn't just a disaster but a turning point? Welcome to Armchair Archaeology, where we uncover the lost stories of the past. Today, we're taking a fresh look at the Bronze Age collapse, not as the sudden end of civilization, but as a moment of reinvention, from the rise of iron technology to the mysterious movements of the Sea Peoples and the surprising innovations that emerged from the ruins. We'll explore how this era reshaped the ancient world in ways that still echo today. And stick around until the end, because we're revealing an astonishing connection between the Bronze Age collapse and something you use every single day without even thinking about it. You won't want to miss this. Before we jump into the mysteries of the Bronze Age collapse, make sure to subscribe to Armchair Archaeology. We explore lost civilizations, ancient technologies, and the biggest historical enigmas. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. First, we need to step back and look at the world that came before it. A world of wealth, power, and deep interconnectedness. From the towering citadels of Mycenaean Greece to the sprawling cities of the Hittite Empire, this was a time of booming trade, political alliances, and technological advancement. Egypt, under its mighty pharaohs, stood as a superpower, while the Assyrians and Babylonians vied for dominance in Mesopotamia. Trade was the lifeblood of this world. The Mediterranean wasn't a barrier, it was a superhighway, connecting powerful civilizations through commerce. Ships carried copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, gold from Nubia, and even Baltic amber into the hands of kings and merchants. The famous Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondences between rulers, reveal a complex network of alliances, where kings sent lavish gifts, arranged strategic marriages, and even bickered over delayed shipments of precious materials. This was an early form of globalization, one that made the world richer, but also dangerously dependent on fragile connections. But beneath this glittering surface, the system was vulnerable. The very interconnectedness that made this world so prosperous also made it fragile. Cities depended on faraway resources, and palace economies controlled every aspect of life: taxation, trade, and food distribution. If even a few key links in this system broke, the entire structure could come crashing down. And that's exactly what happened. The world of powerful kings and mighty empires wasn't as stable as it seemed. When the crisis came, it didn't just topple kingdoms, it shattered the foundations of the ancient world, forcing civilizations to rebuild in ways no one could have predicted. Imagine being a merchant in Ugarit, watching your city's walls crumble as unknown warriors storm the streets. Or a farmer in Anatolia, staring at a dry, cracked field where crops once thrived. For centuries, the Sea Peoples have been blamed for the Bronze Age collapse. For centuries, the Sea Peoples have been blamed for the Bronze Age collapse. Egyptian records describe them as ruthless raiders, sweeping across the Mediterranean, toppling kingdoms and leaving cities in flames. Pharaoh Ramesses III fought desperate battles against them, and his inscriptions at Medinet Habu depict a chaotic war at sea. But were the Sea Peoples truly the destroyers of civilization, or were they something else entirely? The Egyptians recorded their names: Peleset, Cheka, Shekelesh, Denyen, and Weshesh, but their origins remain mysterious. Some scholars believe they came from the Aegean, possibly displaced Mycenaeans or Cretans. Others suggest they were not a single group, but a mix of migrants, refugees, and opportunistic raiders moving in response to larger forces at play. One of the most intriguing clues comes from the cities they attacked. While some, like Ugarit, were violently destroyed, others show signs of resettlement rather than annihilation. In Canaan, the Peliset, who many believe became the Philistines, established new settlements, bringing unique pottery styles, metalworking techniques, and even changes in diet. Instead of just burning and pillaging, were some of these groups seeking a new home? The artwork at Medinet Habu offers another revealing detail. Some depictions of the Sea Peoples include women and children. This suggests they weren't just warriors, but migrating communities, entire populations on the move, possibly fleeing war, famine, or climate disaster. Egyptian records also mention battles against foreigners from the north, who had arrived with their families, further supporting the idea that this was not a typical military invasion. Interestingly, some captured Sea Peoples were later absorbed into Egyptian society as mercenaries and settlers, blending into the very world they had once been blamed for destroying. If they weren't purely invaders, then the real question is, what were they running from? The answer might not lie in war, but in a far more relentless force: climate change. By the way, if lost civilizations and cultural mysteries fascinate you, you'll love our ebook, Secrets of the Ancient World. It uncovers forgotten empires, mysterious migrations, and ancient technologies that shaped history. Grab your copy from the pinned comment. While battles raged across the Mediterranean, another, far more insidious force was wreaking havoc: climate change. Recent studies have revealed that around 1200 BCE, the eastern Mediterranean suffered a prolonged period of drought that may have lasted for up to 300 years. And in a world where agriculture was the backbone of civilization, this was nothing short of catastrophic. The skies dried up, rain became a distant memory, and the once fertile fields of Anatolia and Greece turned to dust. Famine swept across the land, forcing people to abandon their homes, searching for food in a world that had none to give. The once prosperous lands of Anatolia, Canaan, and Greece struggled to produce enough food, and populations began to suffer. Letters from the Hittite Empire plead for emergency grain shipments, desperate attempts to feed a starving population. Egyptian records describe a time of hardship when years of drought strained the empire's resources. Archaeological evidence from sites across the Levant shows signs of malnutrition, abandoned fields, and empty granaries. Without food, social unrest was inevitable. But this wasn't just a local crisis. Studies suggest that global climate shifts, possibly linked to volcanic activity or changes in ocean currents, disrupted weather patterns as far away as China. When food ran out, entire societies unraveled. The Hittites, struggling to maintain their empire, faced revolts from within. In Greece, once thriving Mycenaean cities were gradually abandoned as populations fled to more fertile lands. Even mighty Egypt, which had withstood countless invasions, was forced to fortify its borders against waves of desperate migrants. Some civilizations, however, found ways to endure. Those that survived had one thing in common: adaptation. Some abandoned their old capitals for more fertile regions, while others restructured their economies. And out of this struggle for survival came an innovation that would transform history: the transition from bronze to iron. What do you think? Was climate change the real cause of the collapse, or just one piece of a larger puzzle? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your take. For nearly 2,000 years, bronze was the foundation of civilization. It armed soldiers equipped farmers, and fueled trade networks stretching across continents. But as the Bronze Age drew to a close, something unprecedented happened. Bronze itself became scarce, and without it, the entire system built around it began to unravel. Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin, and while copper was relatively common, tin was much harder to find. The major tin sources, located in modern-day Afghanistan, Turkey, and possibly as far as Cornwall in England, relied on complex, long-distance trade routes. But as wars, economic instability, and natural disasters disrupted these networks, the tin supply dwindled. Without tin, bronze production slowed, and civilizations that had relied on it for weapons, tools, and infrastructure were left scrambling for alternatives. Archaeological evidence shows that in the final years of the Bronze Age, people began recycling metal on a massive scale. Old weapons were reforged, broken tools were melted down, desperate attempts to stretch out the dwindling supply. Some regions even experimented with lower-quality bronze, containing less tin, as a way to compensate for shortages. But gradually, another solution emerged. Enter iron. Unlike tin, iron ore was abundant and could be found in many regions. At first, iron was stubborn, brittle, difficult to shape, and inferior to bronze. But necessity is the mother of invention. Blacksmiths, through trial and error, discovered its secrets, forging weapons and tools stronger than anything before. What began as a desperate measure became a revolution, one that would shape warfare, industry, and the course of human history. What started as a desperate measure became a revolution. The shift from bronze to iron wasn't a regression, it was an advancement. Iron would reshape warfare, economies, and society itself. The collapse of the old system forced humanity to embrace a new one, proving once again that necessity is the mother of invention. The Bronze Age was dominated by vast, centralized empires. Kings ruled from towering palaces, controlling trade, law, and military forces through sprawling bureaucracies. The Hittites controlled Anatolia. The Mycenaean kings dominated Greece, and Egyptian pharaohs held power over Canaan. But when these mighty states collapsed, something unexpected happened. Instead of a new empire rising to take their place, smaller, independent societies emerged and thrived. Before the collapse, these civilizations relied on palace economies, where wealth and resources were controlled by a central authority. Palaces dictated trade, stored surplus grain, and taxed their populations. But this rigid system had a fatal flaw. It couldn't handle large-scale disruptions. As climate stress, invasions, and trade breakdowns hit one after another, these bureaucracies struggled to respond. When the palace centers fell, so did their control over food, trade, and governance. But rather than total anarchy, something remarkable happened. New political systems began to form. In Greece, Mycenaean kingdoms fractured into small, self-sufficient communities, many of which relocated to defensible highland settlements. In Canaan, the collapse of Egyptian rule allowed for the rise of new cultural groups, including the early Israelites and Philistines. Even the Hittite world didn't vanish. Instead, it splintered into Neo-Hittite city-states that lasted for centuries, preserving elements of their former empire. This shift didn't just change politics, it transformed daily life. With no centralized economy, people had to become more self-sufficient. Trade networks adapted, shifting from luxury imports to practical goods. And in this fragmented world, new ideas about governance took root. In Greece, this period laid the foundation for something revolutionary: the rise of the polis, the city-state model that would later give birth to democracy. Without kings ruling from massive palaces, people had to organize themselves differently. Small communities held councils, leaders were chosen based on merit, and new ideas about governance began to take root. These shifts weren't just survival tactics, they were the early seeds of democracy, a system that would later shape the Western world. If you're enjoying this exploration into history, consider supporting the channel with a super thanks. Your support helps us bring more high-quality history content your way. A huge thank you to everyone who contributes. It really means the world. The collapse of Bronze Age empires wasn't the end of civilization. It was the beginning of something new. The collapse of Mycenaean Greece is often described as the beginning of a dark age. Cities were abandoned, long-distance trade dwindled, and the art of writing disappeared. The linear B script, used by Mycenaean scribes, simply vanished. Monumental architecture stopped, and many once great centers of power, like Mycenae and Pylos, were reduced to ruins. But was this truly a period of decline, or was something new taking shape beneath the surface? After the fall of the Mycenaean palaces, Greece didn't become a wasteland. It reorganized. Large kingdoms broke into smaller, independent communities, many relocating to defensible highland settlements. The once massive fortresses of Mycenaean rulers gave way to simpler village life, where power was no longer concentrated in royal palaces, but in local chieftains and warrior leaders. These smaller communities created their own traditions, free from palace control. Without centralized power, long-distance trade shrank, but it didn't vanish. Greek settlements still maintained connections with Cyprus and the Near East, as seen in evolving pottery styles that show foreign influences. Weapons and tools transitioned from bronze to iron, making them more accessible and practical for smaller communities. And while writing was lost for centuries, oral traditions flourished. This was the time when epic tales like the Iliad and the Odyssey took shape, passed down through generations, before finally being written down centuries later. Perhaps the most remarkable transformation was political. In this fragmented world, power was no longer concentrated in the hands of a few kings. Instead, communities began making decisions collectively, planting the early seeds of democracy. Over time, these city-states, the polis, would grow into the foundations of classical Greece. So was this truly a dark age, or was it the first step towards something far greater? The fall of the Hittite Empire is one of the most striking examples of how the Bronze Age collapse reshaped the ancient world. Once a dominant force in Anatolia, the Hittites controlled vast territories, rivaling Egypt and Assyria. Their capital, Hattusa, was a sprawling metropolis filled with grand temples, administrative centers, and an extensive archive of diplomatic records. Yet, within a single generation, their empire vanished. For years, historians believed the Hittites were completely wiped out, another casualty of the widespread collapse. Hattusa was burned and abandoned, its once mighty walls crumbling into the landscape. But recent discoveries suggest that while the empire fell, its people and culture survived. In the wake of Hattusa's destruction, smaller Neo-Hittite city-states emerged across southern Anatolia and northern Syria. Cities like Carchemish, Malatya, and Aleppo carried on Hittite traditions for centuries, preserving their language, religious practices, and even their legal codes. Some Neo-Hittite rulers claimed direct descent from the old Hittite kings, reinforcing their legitimacy. Instead of a total collapse, the Hittites had decentralized. Archaeological evidence suggests that many former Hittite cities weren't violently destroyed, but rather gradually abandoned, a sign that internal struggles, economic pressures, and climate change may have played as much of a role in their downfall as external invasions. The once mighty Hittite army which had dominated Anatolia for centuries, may have been unable to support its vast territory as resources became scarcer. Despite their empire's fall, the Hittites' influence lived on. Their language continued to be written in Neo-Hittite inscriptions for centuries, and their legal codes and political traditions influenced the rising Assyrian and Aramean states. Rather than vanishing, the Hittites adapted, proving that collapse doesn't always mean extinction. If you want to take your exploration of ancient mysteries even further, our ebook, Secrets of the Ancient World, is your perfect guide. Delve into lost civilizations, ancient technologies, and the biggest historical enigmas of all time. The link is in the pinned comment. Don't miss out. And as we'll see next, not every region suffered equally. Some even thrived in the aftermath. The Bronze Age collapse brought devastation to many civilizations, but not everyone suffered equally. While empires crumbled and cities burned, some societies found ways to adapt, survive, and even thrive in the New World. The key to their survival? Flexibility, decentralization, and a willingness to embrace change. One of the biggest winners of this era was the Phoenicians. While Mycenaean Greece and the Hittite Empire fell into ruin, the Phoenicians, a collection of independent city-states along the Levantine coast, emerged stronger than ever. Instead of relying on massive palaces or rigid bureaucracies, Phoenician society was built around trade, seafaring, and adaptability. When land routes collapsed, they expanded their maritime networks, developing some of the fastest and most advanced ships of their time. This ability to pivot allowed them to dominate Mediterranean trade for centuries to come. Similarly, in Mesopotamia, Assyria not only survived the collapse, but used it to expand its influence. While Babylon struggled with internal instability, the Assyrians maintained their military and economic strength, eventually rising to become one of the most powerful empires of the Iron Age. By adapting their military strategies and governance, they ensured their dominance in the centuries that followed. Even in Greece, while major cities fell, some settlements persisted. Athens, for example, remained inhabited throughout the so-called Dark Age, positioning itself for future prominence. Small, fortified communities in the mountains and islands allowed Greek culture to survive, even as palatial centers vanished. The lesson is clear. Those who adapted to decentralization, new trade routes, and emerging technologies weren't just survivors, they were the future. The fall of one system was the birth of another, setting the stage for the civilizations that would define the next age. The Bronze Age collapse is often described as an apocalyptic event. Cities burned, civilizations vanished, and writing systems disappeared. But archaeology reveals a more complex picture. While destruction was widespread, not every city was reduced to rubble, and not every culture was lost. Alongside the ruins, we find evidence of migration, adaptation, and even resilience. One of the most striking pieces of evidence is the destruction layers found in major cities. Excavations at sites like Ugarit, Hattusa, and Mycenae show signs of violent ends, burned buildings, shattered walls, and unburied bodies. But here's where it gets interesting. Not every city suffered the same fate. Some, like Byblos in the Levant, continued to thrive. Others, like Athens, remained occupied, even as the palace systems collapsed. This suggests that while some regions fell into chaos, others found ways to endure and adapt. Another key clue comes from migration patterns. Archaeologists have found that many cities in Greece and Anatolia were abandoned in favor of smaller, more defensible hilltop settlements. Meanwhile, new cultural influences appeared in the Levant, likely tied to the arrival of the Sea Peoples and other displaced groups. The sudden spread of Philistine pottery in Canaan suggests not just invasion but settlement. a sign that the collapse wasn't just about destruction, but about people moving and rebuilding. Even in places that did fall, we find continuity. The disappearance of palace-run writing systems like Linear B didn't mean the end of literacy. Soon after, the Phoenicians developed a simpler phonetic script, the foundation of the alphabet we use today. The evidence is clear. The Bronze Age didn't simply end, it evolved. And as we piece together these ancient clues, we see that from the ashes of the old world, the seeds of a new one were already beginning to grow. The fall of the Bronze Age world may seem like a distant event, but its story feels eerily familiar. A globalized economy reliant on fragile trade networks, powerful states struggling with climate change, migration, and internal strife, societies forced to adapt or collapse. Sound familiar? The same forces that reshaped the ancient world are still at play today. One of the biggest parallels is climate change. Studies show that the prolonged droughts that helped trigger the Bronze Age collapse weren't unique. Similar shifts in rainfall patterns and temperature fluctuations have been linked to the fall of other civilizations, from the Maya to the Akkadians. Today, we face our own climate crisis, with extreme weather, desertification, and food insecurity threatening vulnerable regions. The question is, will we adapt better than the ancients did? Another key similarity is the fragility of interconnected systems. The Bronze Age relied on long-distance trade for essential goods like tin and grain. When those routes were disrupted, entire economies collapsed. In our modern world, supply chain disruptions, whether from pandemics, wars, or political instability, can have worldwide consequences. The lesson? Over-reliance on a single system makes civilizations vulnerable. Perhaps the most striking connection is social and political upheaval. The collapse of palace economies led to decentralization, but also to new political ideas. In Greece, this shift eventually gave rise to democracy. Could modern political instability be leading us toward a similar transformation? The Bronze Age collapse wasn't just a disaster, it was a turning point. And if history teaches us anything, it's that change is inevitable. But collapse doesn't have to be. The Bronze Age collapse wasn't just the end of an era, it was the beginning of something new. Yes, great cities fell, empires crumbled, and trade routes vanished. But in the aftermath, new societies emerged, new technologies flourished, and the ancient world adapted in ways that shaped history for centuries to come. The so-called Dark Age was, in many ways, a time of reinvention. This period forced people to rethink how they lived. Without massive palace economies to depend on, communities became more self-sufficient. The shift from bronze to iron allowed weapons and tools to be produced locally rather than relying on distant trade networks. And the decentralization of power led to new political structures, setting the stage for the rise of the city-state, the spread of new writing systems, and ultimately the birth of democracy. And now, as promised, here's the incredible connection between the Bronze Age collapse and our modern world. One of its most lasting legacies is the very alphabet you're using right now. The Phoenicians, who thrived after the collapse, developed a revolutionary writing system, one based on sounds rather than complex symbols. This innovation influenced the Greek alphabet, which led to Latin, and ultimately to the letters we use today. In a way, the destruction of the Bronze Age world helped shape the way we communicate in the modern era. History isn't just about destruction, it's about transformation. The Bronze Age world didn't vanish, it evolved. And if there's one lesson to take from this story, it's that collapse isn't inevitable. Adaptation is the key to survival. Thank you for embarking on this journey through one of history's greatest turning points. If you enjoyed this exploration, Support Armchair Archaeology by giving this video a thumbs up and subscribing for more deep dives into ancient history. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Now that you've seen the rise and fall of civilizations, here's a question for you. If our modern world faced a collapse, what would be our turning point? Would we adapt like the Phoenicians or struggle like the Mycenaeans? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm excited to see what you think. Until our next adventure, keep exploring, keep questioning, and remember, the past is never as far away as it seems.